The blessings of the four-armed Emperor be on you all. Let's talk about the mightiest and weakest of these mutants equipped with mining weapons out there, with a tier list of Genestealer cult units in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Genestealer cults, and in this video I thought we'd talk through the Genestealer cult, go through each unit in the codex, and talk about where I'd rank it in terms of power. At the moment I'd say that the Genestealer cult index isn't in too bad a spot power-wise, though I certainly feel that some units are a lot stronger than others right now. Initially out of the gate in 10th edition they were pretty much one of the strongest armies in the game. A truly ridiculous win rate of around about 65% of tournament games, really not all that far behind Eldari, though Games Workshop did respond to that with some pretty big nerfs to Cult Ambush and some points cost, and now I'd say they're in a fairly nice place, pretty much upper mid tier of 40k, a win rate of around about 50%, and at least most of the units in the index are kind of usable, though I'd say that the most competitive ones are maybe a bit more of a tighter group. They still seem to be taking down events with some regularity though. So far I believe they've won 3 biggish tournaments since the data slate, and that's still more than the majority of armies in the game. In this video I thought we'd talk through each and every Genestealer cult datasheet, rank them into a rough power level of 4 different tiers, and say why I've ranked them where I have. As always, tier lists in Warhammer 40k are kind of arbitrary. Some things are going to be on the borderlines, and some picks might fit in better or worse with your own army depending on playstyle or what else you're fielding. So I treat this as a little bit more of a general overview than anything else. This tier list is based both on what people generally tend to run regularly at competitive tournaments, plus a community vote for which units are the most interesting right now, and my own understanding of the index. With all that in mind, I've ranked them into 4 different tiers, though I did split tier 1 into a vague upper and lower half as well, just for a little bit more discretion, and we'll get to that at the time. Starting out, let's go through the things that are perhaps least commonly taken in competitive armies at the moment, and in general since the rules dropped, the Magus has been perhaps one of the most unfortunate characters of 10th edition, going from being really quite a staple in 9th to being very niche now. A 50-point character that gives you a 5+ feel no pain, though only against psychic attacks, which is very niche, a tiny bit of melee that isn't really worth considering too much compared with the other characters, leaving you with the only major attraction being a -1 to hit spell with a fairly short range and triggers in the enemy shooting phase, which means that if they really care about it too much, they could potentially just move their units out of range for it. The debuff itself definitely isn't too bad, could certainly help your unit survive a little bit more against an oncoming scary enemy unit, but overall it's just not going to be worth 50 points. There's so many other characters vying for competition, some of which are really quite good, and at the moment I would rate the Magus as being standout weak. Moving up into tier 3, these I'd consider lesser played datasheets, though certainly have more reason to take them than the Magus I think. Here I've chosen to rank the Jackal Alphas, Metamorphs and the Locust. The Jackal Alphas is a 60-point sniper bite character. They have to attach to the Jackal squad and come equipped with a Strength 5 AP2 Damage 3 sniper, which I guess is handy enough to have. The sniper has the special rule that if you hit a unit, then you get to reroll hit rolls of 1 when you're shooting with other units, which is a handy enough shooting buff that might collide with other buffs that other units might have, say the Primus leading squads or the Acolyte hybrids getting reroll hit rolls of 1 anyway. Then its bonus ability is to confer a move-shoot move of 6 inches to Jackals, though it no longer triggers the demo charge mechanism that they've had for a second time. Previously you could have that kind of daft combo where you'd average something like 11 mortal wounds due to the Jackal Alphas allowing you to move, shoot, move and trigger demo charges twice in a row. Overall I'd say they're not unusable as a skirmish unit, definitely could make Jackals a little bit faster as well. Between the move, shoot, move and the damage buff is worth something. Just feels like overall for 150 points you've got a unit that isn't doing a spectacularly large amount, isn't really all that tough, and it's kind of hard to hide behind terrain just due to the big footprint of some fairly chunky bikes plus the wolf quad. I wouldn't say they're unplayable, but maybe just a bit niche. Next up, and also kind of rarely seen compared with their Acolyte hybrid rivals, are the hybrid Metamorphs. These guys are a little bit cheaper than the Acolytes, 80 points rather than 85, but that does come at the expense of just not really being able to deal with hard targets very well. They neither get the big punchy heavy hitting demo charges that they can throw at close range, nor the heavy mining weapons for some high AP multi-damage combat. Instead they are a bit more threatening against infantry, a bunch of attacks with damage 2 if they want them, or more anti-horde attacks at damage 1. They can pack hand flamers, which is nice enough. They get to scout 6 inches, and they get to fight on death on a 3+ as well, meaning they're a bit trickier to take down if the enemy is playing a lot of melee units. Overall though, for their points cost and threat and not being battle line with lower objective control, in general these guys just don't tend to get taken anywhere near as much as the Acolytes. I think in general it's worth having the extra 5 points to pay for demo charges and things that can properly damage heavies. Lastly for this tier is the Genestealer Cult Locus, 45 points for Sinister Bodyguard Man with a pair of blades. Overall I'd say he maybe isn't too bad value for a melee focused squad. He does chip in with 5 attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2, quite a big threat to Space Marines there, and he does also allow the squad to fight first, meaning that they can be very tricky to charge. Otherwise he can help out characters, making them a little bit harder to snipe, and comes with a 4+ invulnerable save, though he's still not exactly durable with only 3 wounds. Overall, for fights first and some okay melee, I really don't think it's a bad deal for 45 points, but in general it seems that Genestealer Cult lists just maybe don't build lists that really want him right now. If you are playing with fighty acolytes with the rock mining weapons, then I think that would actually make him a much better and interesting pick. I feel like most people tend to go for the ones with the demo charges right now though. And I feel like he's just not really all that necessary in, say, units like Neophytes or the Metamorphs, where the fights first doesn't matter as much, given that they can have a good chance of fighting on death anyway. Overall, maybe more of a case of just being a bad fit for units right now than being objectively bad, and does face lots of character competition. Moving onwards and upwards to Tier 2, these are the units that I consider are usable enough. Not unreasonable choices in an army list. They would expect their use to be a lot more limited, not really spammed anywhere near as much, and maybe not going too heavy on choices from this section compared with Tier 1. First up, we've got the namesake of the Codex in the Pure Strain Genestealers, 85 points for 5 or 170 for 10. Somewhat tankier than they might have been in the past with their 2 wounds and 5+ invulnerable save. And in Codex Genestealer Cult, these guys are basically the ones that you're paying a premium for a first turn charge with, getting to infiltrate and then have a very long threat range with 8-inch move and built-in advance and charge. Can always be really quite disruptive if the opponent starts the game fighting for their lives in their own deployment zone. They could certainly clear out a whole bunch of enemy lighter infantry with their strength 4 and AP 2 damage 1 attacks, but against anything that's particularly tough, anything with toughness 5 or lots of wounds and things, they are going to struggle. I don't think it's awful to have some of them though. Having early game and infiltrating options is generally handy. Next up, we've got the Patriarch for 85 points. He gives the Pure Strain Genestealers devastating wounds melee, which does make them a bit punchier against the tough stuff, and then he backs them up with a much more general purpose attack profile, 5 attacks at strength 6, AP 2, damage 2, twin linked and devastating wounds, extra nasty against things like Terminators and 2 wound Space Marines, and at least his own personal toughness isn't too bad compared with a fair few of the other characters out there. Again, I feel like for 85 points he's alright, but not standout or auto-include or anything. Not unusable, but not one of the strongest units in the Codex. Next up, we've got the Atalan Jackals, the Scout Bikers, 90 points for 5 of them, 180 for 10. Each 5 give you 12 wounds worth of toughness for Scout Bikes. They get to scout 9 inches into the midboard, and then have a fairly good movement characteristic for early game disruption and move blocking and things. They're not too bad general purpose damage dealers at close range. They have some small arm shooting, power weapons on the regular bikers, the demo run for some mortal wounds nearby, plus a quad maybe with a mining laser to threaten vehicles a bit. At 90 points though, I do feel they're a bit on the pricey side for a sacrificial scout unit. For more expendable stuff, I think you'd hope the units might be a little bit cheaper than this. I don't think they're quite priced into unusability, though I wouldn't go too heavy on them. Next up, we've got the Goliath Truck, 410 points. This one feels like a transport that is paying a premium for what it does. Its defensive profile isn't really all that exciting at toughness 9 and 10 wounds, and then it has autocannons, stubber, demo charge, cache, and an open top firing deck, so potentially can be at least fairly shooty with, say, a squad of neophytes embarked or something. It could be a pretty easy way to deliver some neophytes or acolytes to the midfield to claim objectives though. It is fairly fast, and when the units disembark you get to reroll wound rolls with the unit that's shooting from them, provided they target something that the Goliath truck has hit. Overall I think it's alright for an objective delivery system, perhaps 1 or 2 of them to deliver squads onto the midfield. Again, not something I'd go really too heavy on, it's just not really all that tough for the cost, and maybe doesn't play into a lot of the army's biggest strengths with Cult Ambush. The Goliath Rock Grinder are put in a kind of similar vein. It's 155 points, so it costs a lot more, though isn't really all that much tougher for the cost, at only gaining toughness 10 compared with the truck. For the extra 45 points, you gain a smaller transport capacity, but a lot more damage. The Drill Dozer blade is pretty threatening up close, and it still gets those demo charges as well, plus one big gun on top, whether it's a heavy mining laser, or a clearance incinerator, or the seismic cannon. For the extra damage gained, I don't think it's too awful. Maybe could even be an interesting enough unit to rapid ingress, weirdly. but I feel like for 155 points it just doesn't have much defense for the cost whatsoever, and to be honest I would have been kind of borderline between ranking it lower tier 2 or higher tier 3. Just feels like against a lot of armies it's not going to get close enough to deal its damage, or it's going to get shot down pretty early. Next up are the other couple of lone operatives that aren't the Reductus Saboteur. Cheap lone operatives are definitely helpful to have for scoring things, particularly when they could be dropping around the board and jumping back into reserve for 1 CP. The Sanctus also gets Infiltrate as well, so you could start him a bit further forward to threaten early game secondaries if you wanted. As the Genestealer Cult Assassin guy, he gets to choose a prey and get ignores cover and devastating wounds against them, and he can advance and charge and fall back and shoot for a little bit more movement than you might expect. I'd still say his weapons aren't particularly standout though, either a single strength 5 AP-2 damage 3 sniper shot with anti-psycho 2+, or a 6 attack bio dagger with strength 3 AP3 and damage 1 with anti-infantry 3+. Overall, between those two, I'd say they're fairly even, though I wouldn't say that either of them is just enormously standout for 50 points, really. Still, though, 50-point lone operatives are just generally handy to have on the board. I'd probably see his chip damage as a bit of a bonus as opposed to the main event for just being a nuisance. The Kelomorph I'd also rank in a similar sort of way, a nice cheap lone operative at 55 points, though I'd say that both the Sanctus and the Kelomorph kind of pale compared with the Reductus Saboteur at the moment, with all the explosive goodness. The Kelomorph's interesting tricks are popping up just somewhere that's just outside of 3 inches of enemies, though it's kind of vulnerable to Overwatch and being gunned down in return, and then attacks with a flurry of strength 5 AP0 damage 1 pistols with devastating wounds and precision. Means that you could maybe assassinate a character with low saves, or just take a chunk out of an infantry unit. In addition, he could be kind of disruptive if the enemy keeps on trying to shoot a unit that's nearby him, as each time they do that he gets to shoot an additional time, so could potentially take a lot of damage off some oncoming enemy and light infantry or something, though it is kind of dependent on them having got within 12 inches of him to start with, which if so, even a burst of small arms fire could just kill him outright. He definitely has interesting tricks though. I feel like given his damage output though, he's probably just going to struggle to kill as many things as his points cost is worth before he gets brought down, and I'd primarily take him as a cheap lone operative, and if so, then the Reductus Saboteur is rather tempting. Finally, there's a couple more characters that I'd rate as quite solid. The Acolyte Icon Ward for 50 points I think is fairly reasonable in maybe a big block of neophytes perhaps. A 5+ Feel No Pain makes them slightly unusually tanky, and he can also potentially save a unit from being removed from the board, as he allows you to reposition a destroyed Cult Ambush token that the enemy managed to move close to. Between those two benefits for 50 points I think is fairly justifiable. Maybe in a neophyte unit that is either not going into Cult Ambush or holding a home field objective or something like that. He does see some kind of niche use compared with the other characters though. I feel like the first choice for squads coming out of Deep Strike is usually going to be the Primus for them over the Acolyte Icon Ward. Finally, for 50 points is the Clamavus. He seems to be a choice that's kind of rarely taken in slightly more casual Genestealer Cult Army lists, but is actually fairly frequently picked up in competitive lists. I think primarily due to his Deep Strike Denial bubble, which is just generally very helpful to have on objectives. It basically means that you know that that objective is completely safe from your opponent being able to charge squads onto it, and also perhaps could be even more relevant against certain armies defending Cult Ambush tokens. If you put down one next to the Clamavus, then your opponent shouldn't be able to move too close to it to scrub it out, unless they actually have units on the board quite near to it. Otherwise, he doesn't do too much really. A Battle Shock debuff with some mortal wounds is a little bit situational. Overall, I'd say it's just not too bad a choice to sit on home field objectives or push towards maybe a slightly safer midfield one. Lastly, we get to the top tier of Genestealer Cult units. These are the units that I most frequently expect to see making up competitive lists, and out of these I've chosen to break it down to an upper half and a lower half. I'd consider the upper half as getting into borderline auto-include territory, where the lower half are maybe just a little bit more take or leave. Starting out, we've got the big and scary Aberrants, 185 for 5 of them, or 370 points for 10. These guys just have brutal general purpose melee with a whole bunch of strength 8, AP2 and damage 3 attacks, pretty much guarantees to put some massive threat on just about anything in the game with that, and perhaps even more notably, they're just ridiculously hard to take out. -1 to wound with a big toughness 6 is huge, a 4+ Feel No Pain, and 3 wounds per model. It's surprising the amount of damage that you can make go away with that little cluster of rules. Most commonly they seem to be used infiltrated up the board with the Meticulous Planner enhancement on either the Biphagus or the Abominant. It's potentially pretty scary stuff to have these guys threatening a first turn charge on something important, and probably having the durability to tank at least a reasonably significant amount of damage if the opponent does go first. To lead them and bear that meticulous planner enhancement, you either need a Biophagus or Abominant. Out of the two, the Biophagus seems to be by far the most commonly taken out of the pair, 60 points for him, and he gives the unit lethal hits, which is a big damage buff against anything that they wound on a 5. It perhaps takes the unit from being a little bit unreliable against enemy heavy hitters into pretty much usually killing just about anything they charge at. And even more than that, it also gives you anti-infantry 2+ for a turn as well. So you can have a turn of wounding infantry like Terminators on 2s as well, so he's still good against them. Otherwise, he also has a single turn where he can get 4 attacks with damage D3+3 against infantry, which is pretty big. It is only AP 0 though. In general, he seems to be the most commonly taken for those pretty excellent buffs. Otherwise though, for 15 points more, you could pick up the Abominant as the other option for bearing Meticulous Planner. I feel like perhaps the Abominant is a tiny bit underrated given his extra durability and things. He gives the Aberrance unit Sustained Hits 1, which is a pretty nice credible damage buff against everything, though it won't help against hard targets quite as much as the Biophagus' boost will. He definitely does chip in against vehicles still though, as he gets 3 attacks at Strength 12, AP 2 and a huge damage D6+1. That plus the sustained hits is still going to really help take down big stuff. And then when the unit gets wiped, he just adds an extra nasty little sting in the tail as he gets up on a 2+ when he's first slain, and it's not exactly trivial to take down in the first place with 5 wounds and a 4+ feel no pain. Overall, he does seem to be slightly less commonly played, though I think realistically he really isn't far behind the Biophagus and isn't a wrong choice. Finally, in the slightly lower half of Tier 1, I've also chosen to rank the Nexos here. The Cult Planner Man can allow you to get a free battle tactic for his lead unit once per turn, and he can be included in units alongside things like a Primus. He seems to be particularly nice when joining neophytes, maybe activating the +1 to wound for a coordinated trap, or the perfect ambush one for extra ballistic skill and extra AP. More stratagems going off on the unit takes their damage output from just kind of good to absolutely great. In addition to that, you also get some Cult Ambush shenanigans as well. You get to move tokens 6 inches in the command phase, which could be kind of nice for having a safe token move forward a bit and be a bit more threatening when the unit comes back. Definitely a nice extra benefit there. Finally though, we're perhaps getting into the best units in the index maybe. And currently out of Cult Leaders, it might be the standard Primus that is reigning supreme at the moment. 90 points for the sort of Genestealer captain pretty much. He gives you B-roll hits for his lead unit, which is absolutely massive with either seismic cannons or with demo charges. Plus there's really quite a big deal with Overwatch as well. If the opponent's moving around in front of the unit, you could put some big hurt on them. That combined with all the other stacking damage shooting buffs that the Genestealer cult can put together means that the neophyte squads can be a massive threat to just about anything in the game. In addition, he can allow you to redeploy 3 units or put them into strategic reserve, and that can be one way to defeat the cap on reserves that you'd normally have in game. You get to put more stuff off the board, and then from there he maybe doesn't do too much else, but can contribute to melee with some bone sword attacks and a needle pistol. Definitely a very strong unit. It's not uncommon to see multiple in lists with squads of neophytes or maybe acolytes. Speaking of which, the acolyte hybrids are 85 points for 5 of them, or 170 points for 10. Kind of pricey models individually at 17 points there. They are only toughness 4 bodies with a 5+ save and OC2. But perhaps their best trig is just providing some absolutely enormous pinpoint damage, using the stratagem to drop anywhere that's greater than 3 inches away of enemies, and then throw a whole bunch of demo charges at them. A pretty hefty and very scary amount of strength 12 shooting with damage too. Ideally they want as many stacked buffs as they possibly can with all that. They can get built-in rerolls of 1 and reroll 1s to wound if the enemy's on an objective. The +1 ballistic skill 1, the sustained hits of dropping in, and the +1 to wound 1 could all be handy against the right targets, and they could get extra AP from the Achilles Ridge Runner. If you are using some combination of those buffs to buff the demo charges, it can actually make the hand flamers that they get surprisingly savage as well. And then when they're on the board, their 3-inch drop could mean that they could set up on objectives. If the enemy manages to injure the squad but not destroy it, you can resurrect models with the Cult icon, and they're also battle line as well, giving them a higher chance to respawn than most. Overall pretty terrifying having units that can just drop close and throw massive bombs all over you. Speaking of demo charges, we've also got the Reductus Saboteur here, 65 points and another lone operative. Like the Sanctus and Kellamorph, again just generally nice to have, means that if you can't get units close to them, then you can't kill them, and that can be big for certain primaries or secondaries. Unlike the Kellamorph or the Sanctus though, whose damage output I would argue is maybe kind of tame, the Reductus Saboteur just comes with all manner of different bombs to throw at you. and if they get a full round of attacks where they get to use most of their explosive weapons, they can really take a big chunk out of the enemy army. For the bomb attacks, you get the grenade stratagem for free, a single one-use demo charge, which is definitely nice to have, remote explosives for some indirect firepower to chip away at enemy light infantry, even if they're hiding safe, and then perhaps the biggest and most spectacular explosion of them all are the reductus explosives, where if the enemy finishes a move within 12 inches of the saboteur, once per game you get a 2+ chance to deal D3+3 mortal wounds, which could well justify a 65-point investment right then and there against the right target. Pretty terrifying if the opponent needs to move, say, a Terminator unit up the board. As for downsides, the Saboteur really is very easy to kill with only 3 wounds if you can get close. Stealth probably isn't going to save them all that much, but just in general, a nice helpful disruptive lone operative with some surprisingly serious damage threat. Seems hard to go too far wrong with Mrs. Demo charges. Next up, and along with the Acolytes and Aberrants, perhaps the other big damage hammer of the army are the Neophyte hybrids. 90 points for 10 guard equivalents, or 180 points for 20 of them, usually tooled up to the brim with 4 seismic cannons and 4 grenade launchers, plus a bunch of small arms. Again, as mentioned with other units, they can make use of all sorts of stacking buffs, quite nice to use with a Primus, particularly as the seismic cannons will often hit on a 5+. And then the Cult Ambush detachment bonus can get them sustained hits, ignores cover, and stratagems for +1 to hit and +1 to wound and more. Then, after they've done their big damage, they're still basically a unit of 20 objective control 2 bodies, which is quite nice for gumming up objectives. If they happen to be able to tag a point, then they have a chance to generate command points in your command phase, which is nice. Can make a unit of them a pretty good choice to hold down a home field objective too. Then they get to replenish slain models due to their cult icon if their squad's injured but not killed, and then if they are killed, there's a pretty high chance to go back into cult ambush because they're battle line. Overall, between all that and just being a very central unit in the codex, I think it would be rare to see many lists that don't take these in good numbers. Finally, last but by no means least, we have the Achilles Ridge Runner, 85 points for 1 or 170 for 2 of them. They're fast moving vehicles with 8 wounds at toughness 7, not particularly good defense for the cost really, but get scout 9 inches and have a very nice AP debuff rule. Something that they manage to hit gets an extra pip of AP against it when your other units shoot it in the shooting phase. That's big for both the Acolytes and the Neophytes and other things. And typically to hand out that debuff nice and reliably, they often tend to take the Heavy Mortar. A little bit of ignores line of sight shooting within 48 inches, but it does mean that the Ridge Runner doesn't actually need line of sight on the unit that you want to try and line up extra damage on. On top of that, you can double down on the debuff by having the Survey Augur to ignore cover against the unit that was hit as well. Might be relevant for some units that started on the board. Handing out extra AP on enemy targets seems to be the most popular use for them. I feel like realistically their other options aren't really all that far behind though. You could have a spotter for better ballistic skill and a heavy mining laser as well for some okay anti-tank damage. And with Scout and a 12-inch move, they could be kind of interesting just for charging up the board and running interference against the right list. Roadblocking a whole bunch of Knight Armigers or something, it could be worth the 85-point sacrifice. In any case though, certainly with a Survey Augur and a Heavy Mortar, I feel like 1 or 2 of these is rarely going to be a bad choice in an army list. Handing out the damage debuff to the units that need it the most, and souping up the AP for your Neophytes or Acolytes. So with the top tier stuff talked about, that brings us to the end of our look at indexed Genestealer cults, and as always let me know which units are working for you and seeing more or less time on the tabletop right now. Any feedback on the tier list for things that should be higher or lower is always appreciated as well, let me know down in the comments. And feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I do tend to post new 40k videos most days. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.